want to welcome you to the beginning of 2 days of discussion about AI and society being hosted here at Stanford University. On the first day, on the first afternoon, the Hoover Institution is organizing this conference to focus on the issues of AI safety. Tomorrow, Stanford HAI, Stanford Center for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, is going to hold an all-day symposium that's going to broaden the aperture out to all the issues of AI and society. I want to take a moment for those of you who have not yet fully absorbed the landscape to understand the elaborate landscape of AI work here at Stanford, of which we're a part. There is Stanford HAI, which has this wonderful symposium tomorrow. Stanford HAI, again, that's Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, includes things like the Center for Research on Foundation Models and a number of other affiliated centers. Also at Stanford, there's the Stanford Center for AI Safety. They tend to define AI safety a little differently than we will today. They're concerned with things like research into the safety of autonomous vehicles, for example. Then there is the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, with which Marietje is closely involved. There's also a Stanford AI Lab, nicknamed SAIL, so there's a whole set of institutions here. The Hoover Institution is an institution that devotes itself to public policy and public affairs, domestic, international, economic, education, and including science and technology. In fact, Hoover has recently been kind of a co-founder of the Stanford Emerging Technology Review, which Amy Ziegert leads at Hoover, along with others, that's designed to help the policy community stay abreast of the most important developments in emerging technology. So here we are today, we're at Hoover. We're working on the policy issues, and we're working on the policy challenge of AI safety. Our first speaker to kind of kick off the conference is Marietje Schaake. Marietje is here at Stanford as the International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center, and she's also a Policy Fellow at Stanford HAI. She's been working on the intersection of technology and policy for a number of years. It was a key part of her portfolio when she was a member from Holland for the European Parliament. She was in the European Parliament for 10 years, representing the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party. She's involved with the UN Scientific Panel on Emerging Technology and AI and a lot of other efforts. And later this year, she's going to have her book coming out from Princeton University Press called The Tech Coup: How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. So, with that, Marietje, over to you.
Thank you so much for bringing us all together and for organizing this very timely discussion on governing for AI safety. After having been here for 4.5 years at Stanford, it's my first time speaking at Hoover, so that is a special moment to remark as well. It shows how many different parts of the campus don't always interact, and I appreciate the fact that they do today. So you asked me to speak a little bit about global governance of AI in 15 minutes, but to make that manageable, I thought I would focus a little bit on the European Union, then a little bit on the United Nations, and end with a question that I think is under-addressed when we talk about AI safety. And some of you may see that as a bit of a provocative question, but we'll get there. The EU, as I'm sure has not escaped you, has recently adopted the first binding comprehensive law on governing artificial intelligence. It's the first such law in the democratic world, while of course the US relies mostly on existing law for understandable political reasons, and while China has binding regulation, it is anchored in a completely different political system, set of values that is not the same or even comparable to that in the democratic world. Now, the EU AI Act is designed to focus on the impact of the application of artificial intelligence. If there's one thing you remember today, I think it's important to keep that in mind. So it does not look at the technology itself, which would be another way to look at governing AI, although there is one exception that I'll talk about later. The law then proceeds to define a spectrum of risk emanating from the use of various AI applications and recommends and requires mitigating steps to be taken by the developers of these AI applications accordingly. So it's proportionate to the level of risk that these mitigating measures kick in. What is important to keep in mind is that this risk-based model also incorporates whether an AI application violates people's rights. I've heard beautiful presentations juxtaposing the risk-based approach to AI governance to the rights-based approach to AI governance. But when it comes to the European Union, these two are very much intertwined. And I'll illustrate that with some examples. And even if the focus of the EU AI Act is on AI risk, the majority of AI applications are anticipated not to present any risk at all, or when an application is in scope, it will probably fall under the minimal risk category, which is anticipated to be the greatest. Now let's take an example of what this minimal risk category looks like. The many interactive or generative AI applications where manipulation could play a role. Think about chatbots, for example. And such minimal risk AI applications are then subject to transparency requirements, meaning that the user must be informed about whether it's interacting with an AI chatbot, or that synthetically generated content should be marked as such and watermarked when that's possible. High-risk applications then fall into several categories. Either an AI system that has become a component of a product that is already subject to safety standards in need of third-party assessment. So think about critical infrastructure or healthcare, where there's a rich body of regulation, and then if you enter AI into the use of these systems, those regulatory oversight processes should incorporate the safety risk emanating from AI. But there are also additional obligations for the providers of these systems to include conformity assessments and detailed documentation of the capabilities of systems. So it's all about understanding better what these systems are capable of. And then there's the most far side of the spectrum, unacceptable risk, which is a very narrow category of AI applications for systems that are used to classify individuals based on behavior. So think about social scoring, or when we think about predicting characteristics or behavior, like crime prediction, or subliminal manipulation. Manipulation so subtle that the person exposed to the application can't really perceive it and could thereby easily be manipulated, for example, in the context of elections. But think also of real-time biometric identification in public spaces, when law enforcement uses them, although there are some narrow exceptions, or systems that actually try to read the emotions of the user in the workplace or in an educational facility. So this gives you a sense of the spectrum of risk that the EU AI Act has as its foundation. But I mentioned there was one exception, which has been hotly debated, so you've probably read about it in the newspaper. But midway in the legislative process, when generative AI broke through, a whole discussion emerged about what the EU should do with foundation models, or general purpose AI systems, as they call it. We call it foundation models here at Stanford. And so many of the political leaders believed that these systems could not be excluded from this first comprehensive AI law, and therefore they were included, meaning that models of a certain scale require extra safety measures, including red teaming, incident reporting to the AI office, and also more documentation about the systems. So this is the exception in the law where the technology itself is in scope, whereas otherwise more the application of the AI models is in scope. The law has recently been adopted, and the operationalizing of it is now entering into action. There's hiring going on, and really the setting up of this AI office that is supposed to be the enforcer of the AI law. And what is unique, and I think a real interesting space to watch also for researchers, is the fact that the EU AI Act is open-ended. And what that means is that it actually anticipates the known unknowns. You won't hear me quoting Donald Rumsfeld often. I hope it's okay here at Hoover today. But we all have to appreciate the reality that there will be new breakthroughs of new AI models. We just don't know exactly what those breakthroughs will be. And so the question is how any law deals with these ongoing innovations that are not precisely written down in the law, but that still have to be accounted for in regulation. And so what the AI office will do is look at these new capabilities and then assess how much of a risk they entail, and then what kind of mitigating measures are to be matched to reduce the risk and protect people. This is a brief summary of the EU AI Act. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but that is one part of what I wanted to share. Now, switching or zooming out to the global level, I thought I would say a little bit about the high-level AI advisory body, which is an advisory body to the UN Secretary General that I have the pleasure of serving on, along with 38 others, from very diverse backgrounds, from all over the world, but also from different professional backgrounds. The idea is really to have a wide spectrum of voices in the room, and I think the UN has succeeded. We're only midway in the process of our mandate. That has been roughly 1 year, so it's very, very quick process. We're expected to present our final report in the fall and have had our interim report published right before Christmas. The starting point of advice that this body gives is that the UN should be complementary to other initiatives, whether they are national or multilateral, that are underway. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, we don't want to overlap with what is working well, but really build on the unique role that the United Nations has, anchored in international rules, built on the universality of human rights, and focusing on broader agendas that are continuing to be important at the UN level, which is the SDGs, for example, and we look at how AI might play a role in achieving them. Critically, the advisory body recommends that the Global South be represented far more than it is today. We see that people, communities, their lived experiences are often excluded from any policy debate, even though if you look at the numbers of people impacted, it's obviously the bulk of the population of our world. And also the unique contexts are really important to keep in mind, because where here we may be talking about how to regulate AI, in other parts of the world the question is, how do you think about AI when you don't have electricity? The challenge is also, how can people in the Global South even have access to supercomputing? How can they interact with it, develop it, and then think about their own policies in their own contexts? Only 35 countries in the world currently have supercomputing capabilities, so there's a big gap to be filled. The advice we give to the Secretary General focuses very strongly on the need to strengthen the public interest over the outsized power of tech companies in the AI space. And we recommend to work to avoid policy fragmentation. I'm sure we'll talk about it today, but with everybody doing their own thing, the risk is that we're going to have a patchwork of measures taken between the EU, the US, the G7, and the question is, how do they all interoperate? How do they work together in order to get the best kind of outcomes for people? So we're only midway, as I mentioned. If you're interested, you can read our interim report. It's actually quite modest, only 20 pages. The title is slightly less modest. It's called Governing AI for Humanity. I'm personally encouraged about where this advisory body is going. I was quite skeptical at the beginning, but I think the firm belief by all members that the recommendations should be anchored in international law and respect for universal human rights is great. And I personally hope that with this advice and with the UN stepping into the space of governing AI beyond what it does through its individual agencies, we have the potential of creating a sort of global bottom line underneath which behavior by companies and countries cannot fall. So to be short, I see around the world enormous momentum in global governance, also a sense among governments not to repeat the mistakes from the past, to be too late to govern this new technology as perhaps they were with social media. There's a broad agreement that governance is needed and is not in conflict with innovation, but is really needed to steer it in the right direction. And we even hear companies in the AI space saying that, which is also unprecedented, I believe. It's less confrontational between the private sector and the public sector. Now, of course, there's on the one hand competition. Every jurisdiction, country, multilateral organization wants to have its own remit and focus on AI governance, but there's also growing collaboration, which I think is encouraging. There's a lot of convergence around risk and safety, the topic of today, but there are other areas that are much less focused. And I thought we would also focus on those a little bit. Because while safety is a clear priority of the UK, the US, and now also Canada, the legal basis for the AI safety institutes in these countries is not there. In the EU it is there, as I mentioned, and the EU very much believes that it puts them in a first mover advantage, meaning laying down the new rules in a new law, may have others around the world looking to its model for inspiration and causing a ripple effect. There are still a lot of questions to be answered for all of these jurisdictions, the US, the UK, Canada, the EU, basically everyone who's dealing with AI governance. Meaning, how will enforcement work? When will oversight take place? So upstream or downstream? Will the enforcement be looking at the very nitty-gritty workings of the systems and the reporting on AI applications? Or will there be a focus on the way in which AI applications interact with people and how they spread around society in their impact? The EU emphasizes the moment that the application hits the market and interacts with people, and I'm guessing, but we'll hear more from the leaders there, that the UK and the US would like to intervene before the systems are placed into the market to avoid safety risks coming from dangerous systems released into the wild. Now, the one thing that is missing from both the executive order in the US and the EU AI Act are rules around the military uses of AI systems, which I believe create risk both through the specific technological aspects, but also through the way in which they are used. The fact that the EU AI Act doesn't focus on military applications has a logical reason, but it's not necessarily helpful. EU member states are still responsible for national security, so the EU sort of federal level is not mandated to focus on issues of national security. But effectively that means that even if there are now harmonized rules across the EU, they do not apply to the use of AI in the military. And similarly, in the executive order, the new rules and implementations of the executive order don't speak about military uses of AI. The EO says explicitly does not cover AI when it's being used as a component of a national security system or a weapon system, for example. And that really leaves the two major democratic blocs in the world without binding rules on what types of AI systems the military or intelligence services can use, for example. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how meaningful are the rules that have been adopted without covering the use in combat zones, in battlefields, especially as we already see that there is a lot of risk emanating from embracing AI in these contexts. And there's also a lack of evidence that these weapon systems can comply with international law, such as distinction when it comes to targets or proportionality. Still, they're being sold around the world, and the venture capitalists around the corner here are very excited about defense tech. So my conclusion here today on the question of global governance is not only what the EU is doing and what the UN is doing, but we should also look at what they're not doing and at the risks to personal safety, to the upholding of the international order, to issues of applying a mandate and oversight to the use of these very invasive systems look like. And I hope we can include the use of AI by the military in our discussions today. Thank you.
That's a great start. I have the burden of introducing myself. I'm Philip Zelikow. I'm a senior fellow here at Hoover, and I am not an AI expert. But hey, I'm at Stanford University. So, of course I know about AI and technology. I breathe the air, I absorb it by osmosis. I got pulled into this issue a little more than a year ago by a group of people who were working on it because they knew I had experience in how to work on policy problems, including policy problems involving dangerous technologies, wars, disasters. It actually turns out to be the third time I've been involved in a national effort working on technology problems. More than 20 years ago, I led an effort for the Markle Foundation on Technology and National Security that helped lead to the creation of things like Palantir, in which I own no stock. And then about 10 years ago, I was the managing director of an effort called Rework America on how the digital economy might interact with American society. So now I've been pulled into these AI safety issues. And I've thought a lot about how to take the AI safety concerns and translate them into policy. And so my comparative advantage is not my mastery of the science of AI. If I have any comparative advantage at all, it's because I have some experience with how to try to solve emerging public problems. So what I want to talk about today is the emerging global agenda to do that. I'm going to cover the politics of AI safety briefly. I want to introduce the concept of designing safe harbors. I want to talk about the synergy of risk assessments and countermeasures, and the synergy of government and frontier companies. I know that introducing future topics with words like synergy is almost like a promise that later on I'm going to be deadly dull, and that will probably be the case, but I'm going to try that it not to be the case. I think there's actually some interesting things here. Let me start with the politics of AI safety. So there are many concerns competing for attention. Marietje did a very good job of introducing the range of concerns that the European Union is trying to address in the AI Act, the range of concerns that are troubling the United Nations high-level panel. There, everything from elections to equity to opportunity to systematic algorithmic discrimination and more. So many clamoring for attention, and there's a sense that if you call out certain AI safety risks, maybe you're taking away the attention that should be devoted to something else that you care about. I'll just tell you straight up, the focus of my presentation is very specific, and it's on catastrophic risk. So tomorrow, Stanford HAI is going to do a broad gauge symposium that's going to cover the whole waterfront of the issues of AI and society. But that is not this presentation. This presentation is narrowly focused only on the stuff that can cause gigantic harm. So you can define catastrophic risk however you think best. Let's say something that kills thousands of people. Yes, that would count. Thousands of people, massive societal trauma, global tension, yes. That it will seem like there's a before and after the event, yes. So 9/11 scale event, which killed 3,000 people, cost $50 billion in relatively immediate costs, and so on, yes, that would count. And some of the catastrophic risks could be on a scale much larger than that. So this is just one subset. Within the area of AI and catastrophic risk, you could summarize this as dealing principally with issues of potential weaponization. So weaponization, right now the principal concerns in weaponization of AI have to do with biological concerns, cyber, maybe chemicals, and then there's a set of concerns having to do with loss of control. One of the things I want to call out is that the politics then of how to think about catastrophic risk have also become somewhat poisonous. So everyone here in the Valley probably has heard of the culture war between EA and EAC, between effective altruism and e-accelerationism, in which there's a sense that, well, it's a set of cultural beliefs about what companies ought to try to do and what they're about, in which the companies, some people are arguing the companies have a real obligation to try to guard progress, and other people think they have a real obligation to foster progress, and they worry that these two sets of belief are in conflict. And this became a bit of a dust-up, for instance, in the battle over the governance of OpenAI. I want to situate the take here on catastrophic risk is kind of in between the two extremes, which is kind of one side you could call them the doomers, and on the other side you could call them, say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let 1,000 AIs bloom, don't do anything to constrain open source models, they will make the world better and better, and if we need to get ready for the succession of machines taking the place of humans, let's start writing our will. So between those two extremes, the concerns here have to do with a set of bounded concerns about catastrophic risk that are already becoming evident, even if they have not materialized this year. How then should someone think about, since there are these extreme views about the risk, how do we sort this out? My argument to you is simply that I'm in a position of grave uncertainty. So let's suppose you wanted to try to figure out how bad are the catastrophic risks. Oh, let's say you turned to the Turing Prize winners who shared the prize in 2018 for kind of the foundations of modern deep learning. Well, that would be, let's see, Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and Yann LeCun. Okay? And let's say we talked to Hinton, Bengio, and LeCun about what do you think are the catastrophic risks. They will not agree. I think I've heard from all three of them, and they do not agree. Yeah, so then here I am. I'm not an AI expert, I told you. But put yourself in the position of someone who is in a situation of public responsibility, as if you had public responsibility. The rational answer would be, I don't know, but I'm worried. I'm uncertain. What are the odds? I've read odds this year of a catastrophic hazard that ranged like in the 5 to 20% range. So these are non-trivial numbers. And whether you think it's 5% or 20%, that's already enough where I better have a risk management strategy. So one thing I will tell you, and I'm confident about, is that if a catastrophic risk materializes that causes really catastrophic harm, there will be enormous public action. That I can tell you for sure. After the COVID pandemic broke out, the United States of America, just at the federal level, spent $5 trillion in discretionary fiscal policy. That didn't necessarily save the more than 1 million Americans who died or the more than 20 million who died worldwide, but it gives you some sense of what people do. So I've led disaster investigations before. I was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. And then I led a national investigation into the COVID crisis that used the book Lessons from the COVID War. I was the director of the COVID crisis group. And I want to shout out my Stanford colleague in that group, David Relman, who is an outstanding virologist. I will tell you one takeaway from these investigations is if we're going to do gigantic stuff to manage catastrophic risk, big takeaway, deep insight, before is better. So one thing you can do, though, if you think about the uncertainty, is you can say, not you're hedging, you could adopt the following assumptions. You could say, innovation will happen. You could say, it will proliferate, including people stealing software. You could say, serious risks are both plausible and their likelihood is uncertain. And you can say that, therefore, these risks are at a level that have to be mitigated and countered. You have to prepare to mitigate or counter them. And then doing it before is better. So that's politics of AI safety. Now let me turn to the idea of designing safe harbors. We have a number of historical models for how to gain insight into dangerous technologies and try to control them, and all these analogies have been suggested in the AI setting, and it's worth briefly noting them. There's the nuclear analogy. For instance, in the nuclear case, we set up governmental labs to try to gain insight after we had the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission right after Hiroshima, and some of these labs are not too far from us. And then on the control side, what we did with nuclear is basically a trade in which people accept a nuclear hierarchy and very rigorous controls, in exchange for which they can access scarce materials and high technology. And we institutionalized this through things like the restricted data system for information control and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, notice that this kind of trade is will arouse a lot of concerns politically, because a lot of people don't accept politically that they should accept a hierarchy in which the United States is once more sitting at the apex, deciding who gets in the door. And there's also a big argument as to technologically whether or not you can control the access, including the issue of open source systems. So the nuclear analogy is actually politically somewhat toxic to a lot of people and technologically contestable. You have the biological model. There again, we set up labs, but actually here the labs were a mix of both government and private labs. In the nuclear case, they were overwhelmingly governmental through much of their early history. Here it's more of a mix of government and private, and by the way, very lightly regulated. One of the efforts at control was the Biological Weapons Convention, ratified in 1972, and another effort at sharing and a little bit of control was the World Health Organization. These entities tended to operate by consensus, they believed in sharing, and their enforcement tools were weak. The result then of that system has been basically nothing done about the inequity in access to advanced biology. A gigantic an industrial biological weapons program created illegally in the Soviet Union in the 1980s and discovered only at the beginning of the 1990s. And the outbreak of a global pandemic, which these organizations did nothing to prevent or contain. So that track record is not necessarily encouraging. There's the greenhouse gases, where we have the IPCC system. Now, what this does is it organizes global science to at least share knowledge, build consensus on the concerns, and establish possible norms. It works consensually and does not seriously attempt control, though there are efforts to pass conventions and enforce the rules of those conventions, and you can see how well that's going. But I think the information side of the IPCC has been very powerful and is an interesting analogy, and actually that's already been adopted in the AI case. Then there are regulatory approaches like licensure. In the case of the EU, for example, you can think of the licensure approach, which is I'm just going to create a gateway and people are just going to have to get a license to operate. You can think about licensure for the use cases, which Marietje referred to and which is where a lot of the EU AI Act is focused. Or you can think about licensure for the models themselves, and they haven't really fully gone there yet, and that's being contemplated. You can really imagine quite elaborate blueprints for trying to set up comprehensive regulatory licensure schemes. In my view, one of the best efforts to imagine such a blueprint is this report that came out in February from Gladstone AI. I think they did a good job. There are things in it I don't agree with, but I think it's a substantial, respectable effort worth people's attention. What I want to call a little bit more attention to, though, is what exists already, which is liability. If you build dangerous products, you're liable for what happens to a very large degree. And the more dangerous the products, the more liable you are for what happens, even if they are being used in unforeseeable ways and they're being misused. I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley are used to thinking that new technological developments have a safe harbor because they grew up under Section 230 of the Communications Act that kind of sheltered platforms. I just want to tell you that safe harbor is not available for AI models. And I think this realization is dawning on a lot of people now. You can read this headline. This is in the Wall Street Journal on March 29th, so 17 days ago. And there is a significant discussion in this article about the catastrophic risk. And by the way, the liability point is relatively simple. If I create or hire an AI agent to do something for me, I've got a principal-agent relationship the same way I would if I hired a human to do that. If hiring the human to do that, like say to carry out mass deception, would get me in trouble, it's not like you avoid that liability by hiring a computer to do it. But then if you create a product that is abnormally dangerous, that's a term of art in tort law, by the way, the level of liability, kind of the way they define negligence, there used to be a doctrine called strict liability. Tort law professors argue over whether it's really strict liability or just a really high standard for negligence, in which if it's abnormally dangerous, you should foresee misuse and you should foresee the unforeseen, and you'll be held liable for that. It's not very well known, but the only reason we have nuclear energy in the United States, for example, is because the nuclear energy industry, companies like Westinghouse, in the 1950s said, we cannot go into this business unless you pass a federal law that immunizes us from civil liability and actually creates an insurance plan. Otherwise, there will be no nuclear power reactors in America. And Congress then passed such a law during the Eisenhower administration called the Price-Anderson Act, which is the reason there's a nuclear power industry at all. Because otherwise the liability issues were simply impossible. Insurance companies could not cover it. So the liability world is very interesting. It is probably the most effective world. It is decentralized, and it effectively governs safety and everything around you. This building and the building codes, the fire codes, the codes governing the use of hazardous things like natural gas, electricity, all this is covered without any regulation being issued by a federal agency at all. It's basically the threat of liability causing the insurance industry to create public-private entities, usually involving engineers, usually which you've never heard of, that write constantly evolving technical standards for how to use things, which are then codified in all kinds of codes that mostly you're unaware of unless you're a homeowner or you have to build something. But are, by the way, extremely effective and are used now worldwide. So the liability area is actually very interesting. And then what happens then is if you build to code, you've basically got a safe harbor. As we did more and more work on how to make buildings safe from fire, it essentially became best practices. The best practices become more and more codified. They become the safe harbor for builders. So you may think, though, that idea of a safe harbor might be appealing. It might be appealing for frontier companies and might be appealing for the government. You might then say, well, what would you need to have in order to have a safe harbor? Here's my version of the requirements for a safe harbor. First, independent evaluation. It's not good enough for the company to say, we invested in evaluation, we're good. We're a conscientious company. And by the way, I think some of them are. And some of them are spending serious amounts of money on what they often call alignment, but which is more than just alignment. But if you want trust, it's got to be independent evaluation. The evaluation has to be well regarded by authorities. And authority figures are both public and private, actually. The evaluation has to be both pre and post-deployment. This is a big idea, by the way. If you want to have independent evaluation pre-deployment, that's a big idea. and requires some very delicate discussions having to do with IP in a fiercely competitive environment. If it's done well, you will then get a better and better idea of what best practices look like, which will then turn into the standards of care that can shelter people from liability. Incidentally, if you think that the civil liability for companies making these products isn't clear enough yet, government can foot stomp the liability dangers without any legislation. Authority figures in government could emphasize liability and call out the existence of better standards and best practices in ways that would be wonderful evidence in any plaintiff's lawsuit. You can create an environment without legislation in which standards of care are already publicly evident to the company, or you could argue they were, and then that will have an effect in the way they would assess their risks. Okay. The last thing I want to call out is that we are already creating emerging institutions for insight and assessment. So Marietje is already a member of the UN high-level panel. That's important. Here at Stanford, you have things like an AI index report that Stanford HAI is putting out. I want to really call attention to the IPCC model is already being endorsed and created in the form of an international scientific report on advanced AI safety. The first such report will be next month at the next AI Safety Summit in Seoul. Marietje and I were both at the first summit that was held last November at Bletchley Park. And they have an expert advisory panel that will produce that report. It's chaired by Yoshua Bengio. You will hear from Bengio in the next session, who will give you a little bit of a preview of that report. So that model, the global sharing of information, help build consensus, maybe establish norms, people are already moving out on that. The other big deal is the creation of the AI Safety Institutes. You will hear later today from the heads of the two existing ones. The pioneer were the British. The leading team for the British are all here. You'll hear from them this afternoon. The Americans are right there with them. You'll hear from the director of the American Institute in the next session. The British right now have more people and more money. And I want to call out two things about the AI Safety Institutes that have been created so far. First, they are not regulatory. They are designed to gather information to reduce uncertainty about the risk and conduct evaluations. The determination of what to do about what they find is not in those entities. And in my view, it should not be in those entities. Their job is to produce information about risks. They are not constituted to judge what risks society should accept. We'll have democratic institutions that will judge what kinds of institutions society, what kind of risks society wants to accept in relation to the trade-offs. That's not necessarily their job. Their job is to inform those judgments. So not necessarily regulatory. And by the way, not being regulatory is the prerequisite to gaining the trust of the companies whom you're going to have to work with intimately to do the work. There are precedents for this, by the way, in other industries. A second thing I want to call out about these institutions is they have the chance of being multinational. To their enormous credit, the British and the Americans 2 weeks ago announced that they were going to pool their efforts. They've created the first AI Safety Institutes. They signed an MOU they announced 2 weeks ago in which they said we're going to pool our work and pool our efforts, which then means that if necessary, the pooled effort can present a face to American companies looking to an American authority or an American entity, and also, say, to a British entity, so the same entity can work, say, with Google DeepMind on the one hand and OpenAI on the other. And actually, Google's on both sides. They're all on both sides of the Atlantic. Multinational safety institutes are going to be important. What will also be important, though, is that the companies are not going to want to work with 100 intermediaries. So it's going to be important for the intermediaries to combine their forces. Let me turn to the synergy of assessments and countermeasures, which is a point I think is not well understood. The people who do the evals are going to be the people you're going to lean on to help design the countermeasures for bad AI. Because they're going to understand, the insiders will have the best understanding of how things could go bad. Now add to that, who actually will do the international risk assessment? So when you think of international risk assessment, don't think of analyzing what Mistral is doing. Think of analyzing what Russia is doing in AI, and North Korea, and others. When I think about the Russian precedent, I think about this, which I remember firsthand. This is a really bad story for those of you who never learned about it. It was entirely clandestine and it was massive. It got discovered through British intelligence, then combining with American intelligence in 1989 and 1990, and then got cleaned up substantially, but not entirely, during the 1990s due to some extraordinary efforts, and is not very well known. But it gives you a sense of, man, everything is possible. So as a government, you have to then prepare. When you're doing the international risk assessment, you have to then say, we don't have to just evaluate what the companies are planning to do. We have to evaluate what the worst people in the world can do, empowered with high technology. That may mean you have to develop assessments of dangers and develop models reflecting those dangers at levels well beyond where the companies want to go, for good reason. So then think about that for a moment. That means that assessing the greatest dangers requires doing highly dangerous research. Then think about who is doing that highly dangerous research and doing it under what security conditions with what relationships to the necessary government agencies. And you begin to see what I mean about the synergy here, which is a very interesting and difficult problem. One thing for sure is that the government itself, simply to conduct the dangerous research, will have to formulate safety and security standards to govern its own work, which it can do under the Defense Production Act without any new legislation, which will then necessarily set best practices and safety standards for any company work that might be nearly at that level. So what you see here, for example, on the left, that's a schematic for a BSL-4 lab. That's biosafety level 4 lab when we do dangerous research on pathogens, which we do now, which is a big deal. BSL-4 labs, there are about nearly 60 of them worldwide, are very difficult to build and very costly to maintain. What you see on the right is a picture of Stanford's lab, which is not at BSL-4, by the way, it's at BSL-3, which is a lower level, but it gives you some sense of what happens in these labs. So the biological analogy is really interesting, because the biology example can tell you that it's possible that the best defense to bad AI may be good AI. For example, if you were trying to defend against the worst possible disease or pathogen, this is a World Health Organization standard chart. And what you would learn from this chart is that if I want to build a vaccine, I have to build the pathogen. I have to understand the worst AI in order to develop the countermeasure for it. That's what we do that's why these are BSL-4 labs, because BSL-4 labs are building and working with the most dangerous pathogens on Earth, because that's the only way to develop vaccines for them. And the same thing may be true in the AI context. Final point, the synergy of government and frontier companies. Notice that the frontier companies need safe harbors, while they also need the government to protect their IP, because the safe harbors require pre-deployment testing and independent evaluation of that, if you're going to do it in a way that invites trust. The governments, however, need the companies, because only the companies will have the capabilities to do the kind of assessments and countermeasures that I'm talking about, even though the companies themselves may not want to go there for their private reasons. Government doesn't have the compute. Government doesn't have the data centers. Government doesn't have the access to electrical power even that the companies will need to do their training runs. So government, if it wants to do work on these problems at this level, is going to need company resources to help them do it. And I don't think we've even begun to really work through how to design that and manage that relationship. So here's what I want to then call out, is I want to call out the possible role of the safety institutes as trusted intermediaries. If the safety institutes are not the regulators, but they're deeply involved in the companies in doing the pre-deployment stuff, the safety institutes will also become, in effect, the labs that have unusual insight into the dangers, and therefore also into how to design the countermeasures. The safety institutes then may become simply crucial in playing the role of the trusted intermediaries between the public and private world that will arm whatever we decide to do in public policy, which is one of the reasons I'm glad you're hearing from the pioneer leaders of the safety institutes later today. So let me stop there, and let's open the floor in our remaining time to your questions.
Yeah, what was the biological program, the Soviet Union that you mentioned, which is so scary? What could have been done to prevent this, or what did we learn we should have done, and maybe how can we translate this to AI today?
Great point. We had a treaty that they simply violated comprehensively on an enormous scale involving thousands of people, with industrial complexes in places like Kazakhstan. So the treaty wasn't good enough. We had no particular enforcement mechanism behind the treaty. We began to get evidence that the Soviets, that something might be amiss when there was a suspicious outbreak of anthrax in what was then called Sverdlovsk, which is now Ekaterinburg again, in 1979. The biology community, by the way, poo-pooed those reports. And in general, the biology community believed all through the 1980s that people who were getting hysterical about those reports were Reaganite conservatives and Uberhawks, and that actually there was really nothing much to worry about there. They took the natural outbreak explanation as probably being true. And then we started getting the defectors from the program. I will say that when the first defector came over, which was in October 1989, to British intelligence, who then shared this with the United States government, this was incredibly secret between those two governments. None of our allies knew about it for some time thereafter, in part because we thought it would blow up the whole diplomacy to end the Cold War if this came out. And we wanted to have very quiet discussions about this with Mikhail Gorbachev and the others. So that kind of lessons learned from that. Well, one lesson is, I will tell you that when the intelligence people found out what was going on, it was actually much worse than they thought was possible. They thought there might be, in the worst case, maybe they are running an experimental program. They had no idea that there was an industrial scale program like this. So the first thing is it induces humility, and then invites you to think. The second thing is you need to take your intelligence mission really seriously. So under the BWC, we had a treaty. We had very modest intelligence work to track this sort of thing around the world. We had very limited national technical means to try to monitor this sort of thing and made very little effort at it. And then when we got some of these reports, we turned to the biology community, and since they discounted them, our governments discounted them too, except for a handful of heretics. And so it's a very sobering experience. Therefore, one of the lessons of this for AI is you have to take the international risk assessments really seriously, and that therefore has these grave implications for the way we organize our work. I'll say that right now our government and our intelligence community is way behind on this stuff. There's more work being done on AI safety in private companies right now than in the American intelligence community. I don't think it's even close. So those are some of the lessons I would call out.
Well, I won't pretend to be an expert on bioweapons in the Soviet era, but I do think this question of a loss of control and who has agency over understanding risk is very important. So in the AI safety discussion, there's a lot of debate about, when might people, engineers, lose control over AI systems. But if you zoom out a little bit, I think we can conclude, and you basically ended on that note, that governments don't have the control or oversight now over what is happening inside companies. And I think that lack of insight means that there's not a good public discussion about what public policy should look like and how we all must understand risk, not just a few people in an agency who, may well gain the capacities to do so, not just a few people inside companies who actually themselves admit that they don't have a handle on how models are going to behave. So maybe we have to conclude that we're in a very dangerous situation where nobody has a real sense of control over the role that AI is allowed to play in our societies. And I wanted to pick up on a point that you made in your presentation, that of safe harbors, and you mentioned Section 230. So there may not be explicit safe harbors for AI developers now that exempt them from liability, but of course there are implicit safe harbors in that there's just a lack of law that governs not only the AI models where we are now, but also what went before. And I think the outsized power of big companies, the role of big tech that has had so much space in this country, cannot be discarded, because what is a core ingredient of AI models? Data. Companies were allowed to collect, process, scrape data from the internet without any legal coverage, not an explicit safe harbor, but also not an explicit prohibition to do so. And so the power that they amassed in that process was then the sort of stepping stone for the power that they have now in developing these models. And so I do think it's really important to look at the notion of control, insight, and oversight in a much more comprehensive way than just trying to isolate what any given AI company or AI model is capable of. We have to see it as an ecosystem, and I think that that would be much more useful.
Next question.
I'm actually from London, so very interested to hear the interaction with the EU and the US. My question is, when you're trying to make policy decisions with incomplete information, and you have predictive AI, which you can use statistical tests for, and generative AI, which is, it's kind of like grading a math test versus a history essay. Has any thought been given to the experience from drug discovery, not AI to pick a compound, but on making decisions with huge consequences, life or death, incomplete information with policy considerations back and forth? Has anyone thought about using some of the lessons from that to inform?
And that was?
Making decisions under conditions of uncertainty where the consequences of getting it wrong are literally human life.
There is a whole literature in engineering world, for example, about risk management and how to manage uncertainty. I've kind of lived these problems more than I have studied them formally. I'm aware of the literature on this, let's say, in intelligence and foreign policy decision-making. I don't think in general it's a very good literature. The main concern here is that you should take away from that literature is you should not try to handicap what will happen. Your job is to handicap the most plausible possibilities of what could happen. And the threshold of plausibility is, this is worth time and money.
So a comparison that I've heard, and I think we can draw from with the whole medical field or pharmaceuticals, are a couple. One, I think it's an important lesson to take away that even very complex challenges can be tackled. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, but when you look at the field of medicine, there are interventions and requirements at almost every step of the way the drugs are produced, the way they're distributed through the pharmacies, the licenses that the doctors need in order to prescribe, the information that you get as a patient, all to try to prevent harm, essentially. So I think that's one thing. The other analogy that I've heard, and I think it can be quite useful, is the question of, and this does relate to bioengineering research, when is a safe moment to release an experimental treatment or an experimental process or research process into the market or society? And with AI, there are hardly any guardrails, right? What is the big driving force? Are market competitions, companies that want to be faster than the other, but not so much a controlled process of saying, hey, we have this very, very potent new innovation. We're going to research it in a lab for, X amount of time until it is considered safe enough or to meet certain criteria to then be released. And so this notion of clinical trials, if you want to use a medical term, has been used in comparison with AI to say maybe we should be more deliberate about the moments when an AI model goes from the research phase that we could potentially all benefit from gaining greater understanding onto the market, instead of it becoming one major societal experiment when these models are just thrown onto the market, only driven by market forces, but not by harm prevention considerations.
So the binary here is the precautionary principle. So the precautionary principle would argue, well, don't release it until we know it has no risk. And the argument is the precautionary principle. I've heard Andreessen talk about this, for example, and he ridicules it with some cause about, well, yes, in that case, we would never have had fire or, anything, automobiles, right, because all these risks. So you've got an extreme version of the precautionary principle, which is an instinct, and people, by the way, tend to be highly risk-averse psychologically and oriented to that, and you can scare people. And then you've got an argument which, gets picked up in the culture war here in the Valley of, we need to foster acceleration. So the middle ground that I've tried to find, and some people I work with try to find, is innovation's going to happen, and if we don't innovate, we may find ourselves in an even worse position. So innovation's going to happen. We have to figure out how to manage the risk. And we may need to deploy things that have certain risks and accept certain risks and accept that as a society we need to manage those risks because we're doing cost-benefit calculations in an environment of uncertainty. I do think that, therefore, we want to understand the risks as best we can and understand how to manage them. In part, if you understand a little bit about how to manage the risks, people are much more likely to accept them and foster innovation, rather than be scared and paralyzed. That gentleman in the blue jacket.
Very good. So thank you. Very interesting discussion. So question here is about, so I'm from Germany originally. So Europe, United States, liability. You pointed out the concept of liability at the very beginning. Liability is dealt with very differently in Europe versus the United States. Perfect example recently, a bunch of companies decided to use a software, applied it to a bunch of millions of cars, right? And as of today, the liability in the United States was dealt with like you have to buy the car back and you get reimbursed. In Germany, there's not a single person sitting in jail yet. So how do you want to apply liability, as a concept to something as complex as AI?
So let me try to draw from your example, which I think is in part an enforcement problem. I mean, when executives are deceptive about products or when there's a harm discovered in any product, then of course there should be consequences. And there will obviously be differences between the EU and the US and how that happened, but the fact that there's nobody held accountable for, I think you're talking about the Volkswagen emissions software scandal, is also a problem of enforcement and perhaps points to the power of the car lobbying industry as well, but that's for another discussion. I think on the one hand it is important, and that's probably also where Philip and I disagree on whether it's better to have non-binding oversight or oversight on the basis of binding law. When you have binding law, including on liability, then the possible consequences when the law is enforced well are obviously firmer. Philip mentioned that companies don't like to have to adhere to different standards, which is true. They prefer a level playing field. But if they have to choose between adhering to a law that's binding or a law that's non-binding, they're probably going to go for adherence to the law that's binding because the consequences of non-compliance are graver. So when you think about liability or accountability of companies in whichever field, I think it's a combination of factors of how forceful is the law and how well is it enforced, what kind of sanctions apply when there's violation. And we're not even close to seeing that sort of mechanism mature in the case of AI. I think we're seeing baby steps taken towards how we can build such a mechanism with different political choices being made. Let's be fair about it, you know. Sometimes by lack of options. I think in the United States, a reference to existing law is also because there are zero expectations of what Congress might do legislatively. So what can you do? Use executive power and use existing laws. It's a different situation in the EU. How will that play out? We'll have to see. But we now have different models to look at. And in both models, or all models, enforcement will be key. And we don't talk about enforcement enough.
This gentleman,
I'd like to expand a bit in the medical field. It's not just risk and benefit. The thing missing is informed consent. And I think AI has to address that. The developer of the product not only has to demonstrate that it's effective and establishes safety, but inform the user. And I think we have to discuss that issue.
I'm not going to argue. I think probably it'll depend on the context of the use case. And that'll be our last one for this session.
Hi. So my question is around the impact of potential geopolitics. I remember reading in the Coming Wave book by Mustafa Sulaiman that one of the challenges is, like, even if, say, countries like US or European Union and others like come together, how do we handle countries like the example you mentioned about Soviet biological weapons, right? Like, how do you deal with countries which may not comply with any of these regulations?
You prepare to protect yourself. I mean, it's a real problem. And I gave the biology example of the aspiration to universality and then the way they approach the enforcement and surveillance and so forth. And this model has not worked well. So then one of the responses, for instance, in the biology case, in the pandemic prevention case, is you have to supplement, voluntary guidelines with serious international intelligence efforts to do global biological surveillance for disease outbreaks without reliance on country reporting, for example, which, by the way, we weren't doing in a sufficiently serious way before 2019. So in this case, you have to assume bad things. It would be nice if you didn't have to, but as a person, if you were in a position of public responsibility, you have to assume pretty good chance of a divided world, pretty good chance of some non-compliant outlaw governments that have some technical skill. So then you just have to prepare accordingly. And but I think actually we're building institutions that are giving us the possibility of developing the capabilities we'll need as they mature and as we add on further refinements. We're in a race now between policy and the development of the technology. Government is way behind. I think Marietje would agree on that. And then the question is whether or not government will catch up, and if so, how do we design the governance role in a way that's going to work? And you saw my argument is that government may actually need to foster innovation if only to understand the dangers.
So some people take the example that you sketch, that of global competition, and what if you restrict your own sector, what will happen to your opponents, as an argument not to do any kind of oversight in the United States. I think it's a familiar argument. We will probably hear a little bit more about it later today as well. And I think any improvement, whether from a moral perspective or from an actual enforcement perspective, has to start somewhere. But what is unique with AI is that so many people are convinced that there is risk in the deployment and behavior of these models. And so if you believe that, then the question is, do you disadvantage yourself by putting guardrails on, or does the jurisdiction that does not put guardrails on invite the biggest risk upon themselves by having unrestricted use of these systems. So I think just from a sort of logical consequence of the argument and from what is morally correct to do, having boundaries that mirror the very principles, existing laws, notions of non-discrimination, protection of the Constitution, very important anchors of a free society merit having guardrails, even if you don't know exactly what your opponent is going to do with the reality that creates.
All right. A quick break. Reconvene back here actually in about 5 minutes.